The Witch Revenge, also known as The Witch of Konotop, or at least that is the English translation of this Ukrainian movie. Now, this is an interesting one in some ways. It's a 2024 movie and it takes place in 2022 in Ukraine at the beginning of the conflict with Russia. And initially we have this couple, the guy's a soldier and he is wanting to get his wife to, or his fiance to safety, and she kind of wants to go to her aunt's house. But along the way they run afoul of a squad of Russian soldiers that end up killing this Ukrainian soldier, the boyfriend, the fiance. And they go on to kind of like maraud this town and rape the individual, the kind of women of this Ukrainian town, and kill people. This fiance, the female, she escapes to her aunt, and it turns out that she is actually a witch that has lived for centuries but has kind of given up being a witch because she was in love with this particular guy. But now he has been killed by these Russian soldiers. She wants revenge, and she takes out this revenge in a bloody fashion. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So this movie is kind of like the inverse of many horror movies that we have seen before. So in a lot of horror films, you'll get a group of individuals, the protagonists are victims, being killed off by some supernatural killer or slasher until we're down to the last kind of like one or two people. And that's kind of what happens here, but the difference is that this time our protagonist is the supernatural entity and our antagonists are this group of victims, or these group of soldiers who slowly kind of get whittled down. So it kind of plays like a traditional horror plot, but kind of the inverse of it, if that makes sense. So it's an interesting idea with that alone, but of course the other factor here is this is based on a conflict which is still currently ongoing at time of recording this review. So it has a sort of political edge to it as well, you might say, because it is a movie, obviously a fantasy movie, a horror movie, but it's really based on a real historical and modern historical event. So that again gives it a somewhat of a unique flavour in some ways. But let's park that, we'll come back on to that. Let's talk about what works just on the kind of the nuts and bolts of this movie. So it's a very well put together film. I have actually reviewed a few horror movies that have come out of Eastern Europe and Russia, and I have found for the most part their production value has been pretty good. And it's the same for this movie that's come out of Ukraine. It's a well put together, nicely produced movie, and it's quite incredible in a way when you think that there's obviously, whilst this movie was being made, they were actually at war with Russia. Apparently the Russian uniforms used for the soldiers were actually real Russian uniforms that were, basically taken off Russian enemies. So it has an area of authenticity to it. But just the general production value here is pretty strong. A lot of it is taking place in this kind of this snowy wilderness, but we have armoured transports and things. So it kind of has a war film edge to it, if that makes sense. But obviously a mix between a kind of war films, or a kind of war crimes film, I guess, but also a horror movie with kind of supernatural elements. Quite a fascinating mix, I would say. The movie is pretty gory. It's not like Terrifier levels of gore. I feel that's the thing we're going to be saying now. But there are some pretty decent kind of gore effects there, done practically. Some fairly kind of horrific wounds, and some sequences that will make you squirm. For example, we have a sequence where a large centipede comes out of a soldier's genitalia. So there you go. You know, so it's fairly graphic in regards to its violence, and we even get, as I say, scenes of kind of rape. So it has that "I spit on your grave" element to it as well. So it goes pretty hard. I wouldn't say it's like massively explicit, but nonetheless, it certainly has a hard edge to it. And there is even scenes, not even the supernatural scenes, where we see these kind of Russian soldiers just kind of like beat down this local Ukrainian village and gun down civilians and things like that in sort of cold blood, which gives it this kind of this kind of feeling that is quite uncomfortable, because you know this is currently going on in real life. So it's somewhat sort of film that will kind of make you feel uneasy, not because of the actual supernatural elements, but because of the real world elements as well. It's obviously spoken in Ukrainian and Russian, and as such, sometimes I find with foreign language movies, the acting is harder to judge. But I do think the acting for the most part was pretty good. You know, I think the soldiers here, we spent a lot of time with these kind of Russian soldiers. You know, the acting is solid, I have to say, certainly. You know, believable, emotional kind of performances and things like that, and I like the way that we have different personalities within this kind of squad of Russian soldiers. Some who are downright, you know, just despicable, and some who are marginally kind of more sympathetic to a degree. So, you know, we get a good mix of different kind of personalities within this kind of group, even though we as the movie are kind of treating them as sort of antagonists and things. I think the imagery with regards to the kind of the supernatural stuff, it's actually sort of fairly, it goes quite far in some kind of like magical kind of sense in regards to these runes appearing all over this witch, and the way the kind of the magic is used and stuff. A lot of it is used to kind of manipulate these kind of soldiers into kind of hurting themselves to a large degree. I thought was kind of quite sort of well done, and it's on a technical level. Just the movie looks really good. It's in this kind of, as I say, the blood against the sort of snow sort of aesthetic that I think is very poignant in movies that kind of choose to have a kind of a snowy setting here. And as I say, it has these real world elements to it that I think give this movie some real heft in regards to kind of emotional sort of punch here. And, you know, the story is simple. It's a simple sort of story. It's easy to kind of follow on. It doesn't end up being too convoluted, but I think it has these elements that are, you know, gives it some originality, as in the inverse of many horror films, and the fact that it's obviously taking place in a actual kind of like war zone area, I think makes it a simple story, but with some elements that seem fresh. So what doesn't work in this movie? I have to say, obviously, you could argue this movie could be somewhat labelled as propaganda. Obviously, it's made to make the Russians look like monsters and the Ukrainians to look like victims, and probably most part people would probably agree with that. But nonetheless, you can't help but feel, is this a little bit like of a propaganda movie to a certain degree? So outside of that, in regards to the supernatural element here, I feel the witch's powers seem a little undefined, and she can kind of do things whatever she wants. It seems. I think to me at least, I felt they've made this witch a little too powerful to a degree, because she could just seem to do all of this stuff and it be you know, fairly kind of out there, pretty powerful, almost godlike to a large degree. And I think it would have benefited from the movie to have certainly some powers, but limited it a little bit, so she at least sort of struggles a little bit more to deal with this squad of soldiers, because at the moment she is sort of so powerful, it's never really a challenge for her. Which brings me to the next point, is that I think when you look at horror films, and I've said it on a few reviews, to make the movie seem tense, and I always feel that you need to give our group of survivors, our group of normally protagonists, but in this case they're a group of antagonists, but you have to give them a chance to come out on top. Because if you don't, it's just like watching the supernatural entity slaughter people until the end, and just kind of like, and there are films that do that, and there are successful films that do that. But I always think to have a degree of drama in the movie, you have to have an element where this group of individuals could come out on top. They could win, even though the odds might be sort of stacked against them to a degree. And when you don't do that, it sort of robs the tension, because it's ultimately you're just watching some type of supernatural entity or a slasher entity just go through like people like a knife through butter, and the tension is therefore somewhat dissipated. And it's kind of true of this movie. I feel like the kind of the Russians, and even though they're playing as antagonists, I feel they should have had a little bit more of getting the upper hand to a degree. Now you could argue, because this is a movie that's come out of Ukraine, they don't want to put that on the Russians, on the Russian characters. They want to have a film which ultimately is someone just like cutting a swathe through Russian soldiers. And I kind of understand that from a political angle. But for a movie, I feel it makes the film have a little less tension than it could have done, because this witch is so powerful, and our group of Russian soldiers don't ever really get to come out on top in any situation. I mean, there's a little bit of conflict towards the end, but even then, it's very sort of short-lived and not really the case anyway. So, it makes the movie have a little bit of less tension maybe than it possibly could have done. So there is that. I mean, there are a couple of elements, particularly in the beginning and the setup, where I feel where we're having this kind of couple before all this stuff sort of goes down. It's a little on the cheesy side, admittedly. But overall, I think this movie is solid. It's very well made. It's visually kind of quite stunning to look at. It's well acted. Story is basic, potentially, and I think it could have been a little bit more in depth. But nonetheless, it's still, I think, a watchable film in regards to kind of story-wise, and the practical kind of effects of this movie are pretty good. I would watch this one again, potentially. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.